Let's understand the world a little better. I'm your host, Timon Wunderlich, and with me is David Stasavage. David Stasavage is a professor in NYU's Department of Politics, and he's also the author of Decline and Rise of Democracy, which is exactly what we want to talk about today, democracy. And I want to dive right in, and I want to ask you, looking at the history of democracy, um, I always think about the Greeks. Aristotle, I think, was talking a lot about it. The different forms of government. Is that where democracy actually started?
Well, that's certainly where the word democracy comes from. The Greeks gave us this word demokratia, which means that the people have power, and so they invented the word. They invented a lot of the language that we have subsequently used to think about democracy, and so their contribution should not be underrated. But democracy itself, in terms of just the basic principle of the people having power in a society, is something that I think was not uniquely invented in one place and at one time. In classical Greece, it emerged in many different world areas at different points in time, and so I think that the standard story that most of us were taught in school tends to go about democracy originating in one place and then moving on perhaps to thinking about Renaissance city states, and then moving on to thinking about the French and American revolutions, and not realizing that the true story is a lot broader than it is often portrayed.
So we know about civilizations that had democratic forms of government prior to the Greeks.
Well, prior to the Greeks or after the Greeks, without having been influenced by the Greeks or knowing the Greeks, yes.
How did these look like? Can you give an example, maybe?
Yeah, so the typical, most common example was for this to happen, and here this applies whether we're talking about pre-colonial Africa, Mesoamerica, North America, elsewhere, would be a fairly small scale society where rule takes place via some form of a council, and there may be an individual leader, but that leader has to share power with the council, and the council is somehow representative of society. In the extreme cases, it may be just an assembly that includes everyone, but more rarely, it's something that, or more commonly, it's something that includes a set fixed number of people. So if you think
Hmm.
of the Huron people that I write about in chapter 2 of the book, who called themselves the Wendats, then that's a good example. Or also the Iroquois, also from the northeastern woodlands of North America, who called themselves the Haudenosaunee.
So monarchies came with larger civilizations then?
Yes, in these early periods, democracy tended to exist generally in small scale societies, and there was something about that form of government that was difficult to scale up, precisely because a lot of it depended on very frequent face to face contact. That was the entire idea, as it were. And so when you think about trying to scale that up, you run into issues, although it was done eventually. And so it was more common for monarchies to be larger, in fact, although there were small monarchies, but and monarchies, it seemed to be something that could be sustained at a larger scale, ruling through a bureaucracy and an army rather than through a council of people that meet face to face very frequently.
So that's basically the reason also why we nowadays, when we have democracies, or the countries that do, are mostly, or I think maybe solely, representative democracies, right? Where we have people that represent us and we don't vote directly.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, unless you want to look at local democracy in terms of town meetings, or how small Swiss cantons and things like that, there are again small scale settings where individual people do participate directly. Or you think of the classic example of the New England town meeting in the United States, but overwhelmingly at the national level, of course, that's just not something that is judged to be feasible, and so Europeans were the first to encounter this issue, and even before anything like modern democracy arose, they evolved a theory and a practice of political representation that allowed for scaling up this idea of governing with a leader jointly with a council.
Mm. And do you think that nowadays or in the future will be possible to have like I think it's called direct democracy, right? Where we vote directly the laws?
There are all sorts of interesting discussions on in that vein. Currently, largely due to our dissatisfaction with in many countries with how democracy is operating. One of the interesting developments that is happening is not everybody voting directly on issues, but having citizens' assemblies where you randomly select a set of citizens to just present their views on a topic. And there's some political theorists who are in favor of that, and there's also quite a bit of actual experience with that more and more commonly. Much more in Europe than in the United States, and the European Commission just published a document um, on December 12th advocating this form of citizen participation.
So what's your opinion on it?
Well, I think it's interesting. Okay, so several things I'd say. It's certainly an interesting development and it's an experiment to explore. Um, and I see it harder to believe that that would be a true substitute for the system of representative democracy we currently have. It might work better as a supplement than as a substitute. Yet it I don't think we know as much yet about how the people participating in these groups, how they actually feel. And let's remember also, most fundamentally, if some ultimately small group of people get selected to participate in the citizens' assembly, that's going to mean that the vast majority of the population are still not participating, right? You can't have a citizens' assembly with several million people. It's just not. It's just not going to work. So that same issue of scale, um, comes back to haunt us.
So they're basically again representatives, right?
Yeah,
In
it's
a
just that
way.
they're chosen in a different way.
Yeah, yeah. Interesting, interesting. And still, I think the idea, or I like the idea actually, because I think they get educated beforehand.
Yes,
So it's
that would
not.
be.
Go
Yeah.
ahead.
Yes, yeah, yeah, yeah. That's generally that would be the way that there would be some briefing or some introduction to, because a lot of the policies that they consider are really have technical aspects to them. Uh,
Yeah, so that's what I would have seen as a problem with a direct democracy. Thinking the representatives that usually that get voted in are highly competent in their job and have studied it for many years, and not the normal citizen. The normal citizen hasn't necessarily, but in these groups, these I forgot the name now. These focus groups, they get specifically educated, so that problem kind of goes out of the window.
or it is it in theory it's minimized somewhat, because in the sort of noble model of political representation, you would have individual legislators who might, be in office for some time and who might acquire expertise in a policy area. Um, and they might have staffers who acquire expertise in a policy area, either who work directly for them or who work for one of the relevant committees. And so there is, in theory, and and mechanism for generating information. And the idea would be that the voters would try to rely on that to some extent. But of course, it doesn't always work that way, and we do get legislators selected who aren't necessarily that informed about anything. And so, trade-offs in each way.
Going back to the transition from democracies, early democracies, to then monarchies, mainly, how did that transition look like? Where were the people willing to give their power in a way away? Did they understand it, or was it more of a that somebody took the power?
I think there are two key ways that it happened. One is via someone being just successful in being self-aggrandizing and acquiring a position that was unassailable, and then going out and perhaps conquering neighboring areas or something like that. And that was that was one way it happened. I think the other, excuse me, the other way it happened was when um, people banded together into larger units for self-defense, and they therefore submitted to the power of a chief, who would, suddenly become more, might be able or might succeed in becoming more of a king, but they might figure out that that was worth it for security reasons.
Mm.
Uh, and so a lot of these early democracies actually had systems in place to try to prevent the this from happening. So the North American, the Native Americans on the North American plains in the 18th and 19th centuries would have a system of a war chief, which would be someone who had extra responsibility and power, but only temporarily so. And that was seen as a way to try to limit um, limit the possibility. Just in the same way that the Roman initial Roman dictatorship was based on the same idea of having someone given extraordinary powers to work on one issue, but temporary powers that were limited in duration.
Do we know what other things changed through that transition, like value systems, for example, or way of thinking, or are there any records?
Well, that's a harder one because a lot of the records are quite sparse, and we have to try to go back to early ethnographic accounts. Or we certainly know a lot more from the European cases, given the everything that's been written. And but in terms of what individual people were thinking, that's a really difficult one because most people weren't necessarily writing down things in a way that they were saying, "I wonder what the individual, person in the street is thinking," as it were. If
Mm.
there was a street, I should say.
Um, Mainly monarchies, right? But you just mentioned dictatorship, but that's not the usual transition from democracy in an early stage. That came later
No,
on,
that's
right?
right. I was just using the example of the early Roman dictatorship before Julius Caesar, where it's quite a successful institution for some time, in that people respected the idea that they exercised these powers, but they were limited duration. And I was just drawing a comparison between the dictatorship and the practice of the war chief on the Great Plains with the
S-
Native Americans.
So was that basically a global or more or less global transition from small democratic civilizations to then larger monarchies?
Well, it certainly happened in some cases that you got very large entities that evolved in Europe and China and the Middle East, South Asia. But then there were other sort of more out of the way areas where that process of aggregation didn't necessarily happen, and it really didn't happen until Europeans came in and conquered everyone. Um, which is, sort of which put an end to things in many respects.
One question I actually always ask, or most of the time ask when I have professors in a somewhat similar field on, is if if the people are not necessarily educated on politics, or are also, as we know by now, easily influenced by propaganda, for example. Um, is there a case to be made, or how do you think about the problem that democracy then isn't as democratic as we would like to be, and is there a case to be made against democracy?
Yeah, so this is a really major question and a really major problem. And I think, in terms of modern democracy, we first encountered this problem in France in 1848, where the Second Republic was established. And a lot of people were very excited about the Republic enduring and having a transition to democracy. And they voted under universal male suffrage. And then, lo and behold, what happened under universal male suffrage is the voters elected people and eventually elected Napoleon III, who became a dictator who put an end to the republic. So
Mm,
since that point, there's been this question, and you could hear a lot of Parisian intellectuals after 1848 wondering, what needed to be done. Should people not be allowed to vote until they were educated or something like that? And I don't think, unfortunately, we don't really have a good solution for that problem, because anything the solution would be worse than the whatever the expression is. It would not be a good solution because you'd be fundamentally infringing the right of people to decide who they want to elect, which is at the core of modern democracy. So you'd be undoing democracy yourself by retreating from that problem.
So there's nothing that academia can think of, or that academia can think of that could potentially be. I mean, this is obviously a value, opinion based question, but could potentially be better than a democracy.
Oh, I mean, I have a personal preference for democracy because I like the idea that I somehow participate in governing things, and that I have some sort of degree of control. Not everybody feels that way. There's certainly a lot of people in other societies, like say China, who feel that they have a very successful system, even if they're not governing themselves, as it were. But the the way to avoid that problem that you get into, where you fear that the citizens will elect someone who will undo democracy, is to try to not to get into the problem in the first place by keeping people educated and connected and seeing that they trust government.
Mm.
And that's the key thing, is to avoid
Oh,
the problem to begin with.
yeah, I would like to say I live in Hamburg, Germany, also a democracy, and I love being in a democracy. But still, I find it interesting that uh, you just said that I don't know if that is from a poll or something, but that Chinese people actually do not necessarily.
Oh no, no,
Have,
no! I'm not speaking for all of
okay,
China. No, 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 no. I'm
yeah,
just
okay, you meant
I'm
more
sure
the
there are some people in China. I don't know how many.
okay.
I've not, but I'm sure there are some people who feel, who look at, say, how things are going in the U.S. currently, and probably feel like their system works pretty well, even if it's not democracy in the sense that we think of democracy. Yeah.
Okay. One thing, one interesting answer I got when I asked this question to Marlene Wind. She's also a professor from Denmark of political science, and she answered, It's not." Basically, what she said is the majority isn't always right. So even in a democracy, even if there are people who are maybe get influenced by propaganda, let's say, there's still legislature in place, and people seem to forget about that. That helps still keep this democratic system and all the other institutions in place. That I found a really interesting answer. What would we say are other um, solutions to threats to democracy?
Well, then that's the other one, is to have a system of checks and balances. And countries vary in the extent to which they have formal checks and balances. In Germany, you have a lot of checks and balances with, a bicameral legislature and a federal system where it's hard for one person to just say, do this, and everybody has to do it. Same as in the US, we have a lot of checks and balances with a federal system and a bicameral legislature and an independent judiciary. Interestingly enough, there's some countries that do quite well but have very few formal checks and balances, and that would be the United Kingdom. No constitution, at least not a written one. The House of Commons really is supreme in a sense, and so if the House of Commons had a majority that passed some crazy thing, um, maybe it wouldn't happen. Maybe the judiciary would step in, but there aren't the same sort of degrees um, of checks and balances that some other countries have. But that's the other way to go. Obviously, is to say, okay, we're just going to divide up power such that if someone gets elected who is something of an anti-democrat, that they themselves won't be able to bring the system down.
Interesting. I didn't know the UK had no constitution.
No, I
That's
mean, they say they have a constitution. It's a system of practices that has developed over time, and their traditions and so on. But that um, there's no formal written. I mean, that's why they had such a problem with Brexit. Any other country having a referendum over something like Brexit, there have been a lot of referenda over things in France with regard to the European Union, for example. But every time there has to be a treaty or some document in advance, and people vote on the document, yay or nay. Whereas this is not what happened in Brexit. Brexit was voting in favor of who knows what, your own preferred version of Brexit you could hope for. And that might differ from person to person.
in the last years, I would even say there have been more and more articles, for example, which mention that democracy is in a crisis, and that there are a lot of threats to democracy worldwide. Could you explain what these are and why did this happen?
Well, it's certainly true that some countries have experienced what we call backsliding, whereas they were on a fairly stable democratic path and then have been less so over time. But I think we need to put that all into comparison to say we're still at a point where there are way more people living, many more people living in under democracy today than was the case in, say, the 1980s. All right. So there's still been a very big net increase, even if there's been some backtracking of late. And then the other thing that's critical to remember is that democracies become something of um, a universal notion that people support, or at least very widely support. So when President Biden had his democracy summit, I think it was back in 2021, the Chinese Communist Party felt prompted to produce a document called Democracy That Works, which they say reflects how things work in China. And Chinese have a word for the democracy that they use to refer to their system. And so the idea of democracy itself has become something that's universal, and that to me means that it's not just going to go away, even if you have individual countries that backtrack from time to time because someone succeeds in um, attaining too much power.
How can China be seen as a democracy?
Well, they have a legislature. They have a system where these people are selected. They are, in theory, doing. You have to read the document. It's an interesting document where they're doing the work of the people on behalf of the people. I wouldn't consider it a democracy, but it's interesting that they felt compelled to use that term. Right. Just the
Mm,
fact that they compelled to use the term says, wow, that word has power.
it
Um,
is.
yeah.
It is. Maybe it's not that easy to actually. How would you define democracy and your idea of it?
Well, so there's always coming back to the Greek definition, which I like, is that the people have power, right? And then the question becomes, what are the mechanisms that you use so that hopefully the people have power? And the mechanism that we use today is in um, at the national level in all democratic countries is to say you're going to vote, have the opportunity to vote every few years for representatives, and those representatives will carry out the business of government, and that you'll be able to constrain them by saying if you're not happy with what they did, you won't reelect them to office. You'll vote them out. And so the question then becomes: is that particular mechanism for generating results something that is success satisfactory in achieving that goal of the people having power, or is it not?
And okay, is that also is that does that kind of go in the same way as the official academic definition? Is there an official academic definition? Is that even something that
Well, there
exists?
are a lot of different definitions, and sometimes some de- you know some definitions of democracy, to my mind, people try to load too much onto it. So they start to say you have to have this, and free press, and which are all good things that we should have. But if you add too many things to the definition of democracy, then the the term kind of becomes meaningless. It almost just becomes like what is good. There is an interesting and much more minimalist definition of modern democracy from my NYU colleague Adam Shaworski, which is to say that democracy is a system where multiple political parties compete in elections, and where incumbents sometimes lose.
Hmm. Hmm. Okay, I would have to think about that longer. Uh, Other than legislature and obviously the democratic voting system, what are other layers in a democracy that should be in place or that usually are there? Are there actually other layers, or is it mainly just that the checks and balances and the voting system itself?
Yeah, I mean, well, layers. There are layers in terms again of like what keeps people connected to government, right? There's layers in terms of civic education, that people understand how their country works, that they have information about their representatives and what they're doing. There's a lot of other things that are kind of necessary for this to work.
Mm. So information, for example, you just mentioned. Are there any others?
Yeah, I mean that's something to, but that's not part of the definition. That's more something to make our system of democracy work. I think requires
Okay,
uh,
and there are a lot of these, so
information, right? Because the theory is you're not just going and choosing. It's not like in the citizens' assembly where you're finding out about the issue and then voting how you choose. You're voting for one of multiple candidates who may have different views on issues, and it'd be good if you knew what their proposals were, and it would be good if once they're in office, you actually know what they've done.
of
Um,
course.
and so that that's a major informational requirement to modern democracy, which sometimes is satisfied and sometimes is definitely not satisfied.
And that's what I meant. So, what other layers like this are there?
Well, I mean, the layer. So we just talked about information. Information also includes basic education, like having an idea how your system of government works. Right? What it's important to know because in the U.S., for example, a lot of people will attribute bad things that happen to the president, even if the president often doesn't directly control a whole lot of things. Right? There are a lot of things that happen that aren't directly so. Inflation, for example, or gas prices in particular, are something that the president has a fairly limited ability to control gas prices, but people end up being unhappy or happy with an incumbent because of how much they pay for gas, which
Hmm.
I think is not a great system because you don't want to choose someone or vote them out of office based on things that they can't control. So you need information, you need that basic education about how things work, um, and I think those are absolutely critical.
To get the people more engaged, right? Because
Yes,
that's a major factor in having a real democracy.
yes, exactly.
Is there any what other ways are there to strengthen democracies? We have more education, basically more information. People know better who to choose, and then probably also that there is a lot of a lot of members to be chosen that people can choose actually.
Yeah, and so the other crucial thing I think to think about is that you want to ask our system is has this characteristic that now basically all adults can participate. So participation is very, very broad, but the vast majority of people only participate quite rarely in politics. When they vote every few years, and so there are open questions about whether people will find that satisfactory or not. And there have been ways in which, at times, citizens have attempted or been given the opportunity to be more engaged directly. And so in the 19th century, for example, in the United States, it was very common for citizens to petition their legislators or legislature, the Congress, send petitions about a particular issue that they was of concern to them. That's more of a form of direct action that doesn't have to wait um, for when you vote. Of course, those are non-binding. The citizens can't send instructions to legislators about what they should do, but it's an interesting way of thinking about the problem. And then the other more recent way in which people can participate, we've already spoken about, and then that again is the citizens' assembly idea, right? So if people get chosen from time to time to participate in a citizens' assembly, that's an interesting question about whether that's going to make them feel more connected than if they're just voting every few years.
Mm.
So broadly, the big picture question is: do people need to have forms of political action activities that aren't just voting every few years, or will they be satisfied with just voting every year? I guess some people probably will be, but some people won't, and they'll start to feel more distant from government.
So that's one of the major indicators, basically. Let's get measured engagement and trying to figure out what is the best ratio.
Well, I'm suggesting that that may be important for people being feeling comfortable with how their democratic system is operating.
Okay, but in academia, it is one indicator that gets looked at a lot.
Well, it's not really, and it's not like it's not like a quantitative indicator or something, but it's something that I'm suggesting is important.
Okay,
I don't know.
okay,
I think some people would not place as much emphasis on that, but I would place a great deal of emphasis on that.
okay, yeah, okay, interesting. Um, do you what do you think about the problems that come when democracies interact or cooperate with autocracies, which is at this point uh, probably not. You probably have to do it as a democracy. When, for example, with China, it's almost impossible for any other country to not take exports from them.
Yeah, no, we can't just pretend that we're only going to cooperate with other democracies because that would lead to a very unsuccessful and very dangerous world, no doubt. So that's just something we have to do in terms of being realistic and realizing that different countries have different political systems, and if democracy is something that's been common across the globe for a very long time, autocracy is also something that's been very common across the globe for a very long time, and these are two alternative ways that societies govern themselves or are governed.
But they go against our value systems in a way that we chose for ourselves, obviously. So we just say what is going on there, that's their decision, and what is going on here, that's ours to make, and we don't care what is going on there. Or
Well, I
are
mean,
there?
there've been a lot of, obviously, the after the fall of the Berlin Wall and the great wave of democratization that took place in so many countries, there was a lot of democracy promotion by the U.S. Um, and by other countries, which is is a good thing, but could also often have a certain paternalistic flavor to it, particularly when ultimately sort of realpolitik questions often decided what got done. So I'm less, it's probably a better signification that if you look at, say, African countries where the Afrobarometer is quite a good public opinion survey. Citizens are the ones who want democracy. It's not because we told them you get to have democracy now that they that they think it's a good idea. It's because they get the idea and they want to govern themselves.
Since the fall of the Berlin Wall, I think that's a good time. Um, were there any democracies, or actually, I know of Hungary, but other than Hungary, were there any democracies that failed, or how many were there that became autocracies again, basically?
Well, and yeah, I guess that, so there are, there the problem is that when democracy starts to fail in a country in more recent years, um, it's not like the old days where some. I mean, there are cases of military coups now, but it's less commonly like the old days where some general would mount a coup, and then you'd have a dictatorship, and you'd have a very clear shift, um, like Chile, say, at 1973, from democracy to dictatorship. Today, when democracies start to fail, it's more like in the Hungarian case where you see various ways in which the elections keep happening. There are multiple political parties participating, but the same party keeps winning, and the same party succeeds in accumulating and setting the rules so that the playing field is no longer level, so that they'll always win. And so you're in more of a gray zone. You can't call it a dictatorship, but it's clearly not a fully functioning democracy. It's something in between.
I think Professor Sergei Guriev, we had him on as well from Sciences Po in Paris. He called these dictatorships spin dictatorships because they've been in the past, they've been a democracy, but more and more or it still is a democracy technically. There's a people can vote, but other candidates don't necessarily make it to the elections, or they or the people don't have the necessary information because propaganda and state media is so dominant. um,
No,
that's basically it, right?
exactly. There are various terms that have been used. Steve Levitsky and Luke Inouye. I forget whether they call it competitive autocracy or competitive authoritarianism. It's one of the two, but you get the idea. It's a term to sort of merge that they have. it looks from the outside as if elections are still happening in your democracy, but it's not really. It's not really full. It's not completely the case.
And if democracies transition to autocracies, that's basically the case. How it happens usually through media domination and rigged elections.
Well, that's a big one. Media domination, sort of redistricting of sorts, all sorts of things, undermining the judiciary. But things can snap back. Look what happened with the recent Polish elections, right?
Mm,
Uh,
yeah.
so,
How can we prevent these things?
well, it's hard, and I think that 20, 25 years ago, when political scientists wrote about the Eastern enlargement of the European Union, one idea was that, well, they're going to be, a country like Hungary is going to be part of Europe. They have to obey all these rules, the acquis communautaire. They have to, and as a result, that will sort of commit them to this democratic path, among other things. Um, and that's the way it was presented at the time. And what you realize is that until they were admitted, yes, it would have been inopportune. Were Hungary a candidate today for EU accession, um, it would not be such a great idea for Orban to do what he was doing, because he'd probably not have a chance of getting admitted to the union given the way he behaves. But once you're in, you can't really get. I mean, not going to get kicked out, basically. So it's hard from the outside to make sure this doesn't happen. It has to be more of an internal discussion to see that this doesn't happen, and it has to be an attempt to avoid personal aggrandizement on the part of one person and one party.
Hmm. Um, a little anecdote, a little story. I'm actually currently watching The Walking Dead, and there's one moment where Rick, that's the leader of the group, who got basically democratically elected, or actually everybody just believed in him and just did what he said. At one point, he says, "This is no longer a democracy. This is a dictatorship now," because he wants to move forward faster, because he doesn't want to argue in certain times where maybe everything is going too fast. Would you say there are some times in which a non-democratic form of government is better than a democratic? Like, is it time? Does it matter at what time we're in? If we're maybe at war, for example, then it's maybe better to have a autocracy than a democracy. Is there a
Well,
point
so
like that to
yeah,
make?
and so that's a classic question that, in a way, we've already encountered that when we talked about the question of the war chief, or the early Roman dictatorship, where, and we have, there are special powers that can be voted for certain groups. There are, that to say that, for a leader or leaders or someone will have power temporarily to try to deal with something because the threat is so great that we can't afford to have the usual back and forth within the legislature to figure this out. The key thing with those emergency powers is keeping them limited in scope and in duration. Because if they become long term,
Mm,
then you risk undermining democracy.
mm. But that's basically one of the or that's basically one argument that could be made for autocracy, that they can at some points move faster.
Yes, that's one that's traditionally made. It's a classic one that's made, and that autocracies can move faster, but they can move faster also, but meaning that they do really stupid things sometimes, and that
Yeah,
there are restraints, right? So it cuts both ways.
yeah, yeah.
Sometimes they're more efficient at doing the right thing, as sometimes they're more efficient at doing the wrong thing.
Um, Actually, before we go to our second segment, we have some rapid fire questions prepared. I would like to ask you: is there anything else that you would like to add? Is there anything else that you would like to mention, to say, before we go to the faster segment?
No, I think we've covered a lot. That's good.
Okay, then over to the rapid fire questions. Are you ready?
Yes.
Okay. Note, some of these are not necessarily just linked to your research, but also maybe just a little more personal questions. So let's start off with a personal one, so you get an idea. If you had a big billboard, everybody would see it. Let's say it's on Times Square. Everybody could look at it. What would you put on it?
Educate yourself about democracy.
What is your favorite quote?
I don't really have a favorite quote. I don't know. It's interesting. I don't have a I mean, I don't have one. And none spring to mind. Oddly enough.
Okay, that's fine. What is your newest, biggest insight?
Well, hopefully you've heard some of them today. No, I think the thing that I'd like to try to keep pushing is that when we're thinking about democracy, look at a wider set of human societies because we can learn more about how it actually functions that way, and it's helpful to come back and then learn more about our democracy and what we could do to strengthen it.
A controversial opinion. I believe what nobody else does.
I'm more of a middle of the roader, actually. So I don't really have any particularly to my knowledge, I don't have any particularly controversial opinions. Yeah.
What would you have liked to know when you were 20?
Oh, everything, right? But then it wouldn't be fun. No, and there's a great episode of the Twilight Zone. This show from the 1950s and 1960s in the U.S. where this guy who's an adult gets transported back in time and he sees his child self and he wants to tell his child self about all these things, and then these people who are there figure he's out from the future and they say, no, don't. This person has to be able to learn it themselves.
Okay, yeah, that's good answer. What do you see? Can I? Yeah. What would you say? Now you basically kind of answered it already. The biggest threat to democracy, or one of the things you said was media domination, for example. Um, how would you throw $1 billion at that problem just for your specific country? Because otherwise it wouldn't be enough. Probably isn't that way still. To solve it, to strengthen, or to hold up against media domination. That
Yeah,
would come up.
I don't know if just throwing money at the problem would help it, but certainly one of the big issues that we have here in the U.S. today is the disappearance of local newspapers. Local newspapers, in very small towns or small cities have all had their own newspapers, and the economics of are such that they're just out competed these days. Yet those were trusted institutions that serve to provide people with information about their democracy, their government, and I think a lot of people are rightly worried about what that implies when you lose these trusted sources that are local newspapers.
How would you spend $10 billion to make the world a better place in general, not necessarily linked to democracy or political science or anything? In general, how would you spend $10 billion to make the world a better place?
By supporting funding for a vaccine for malaria. There's a lot of funding that's going into that already, but one of the unambiguous positive things of recent decades has been the way in which there have been huge advances in health, not just in rich countries but in poor countries as well. And there are millions of people who die of malaria every year, and a vaccine against it would be a truly remarkable thing.
What is what would you say, other than your book, obviously, is the best way to inform oneself about democracy and politics in general?
Well, I think is to find some of these legacy newspaper sources, or it depends what country you're in. In one of the things that's great about the United Kingdom, for example, is people are still very trusting of the BBC. The BBC just ran what they call the Rife lectures that a colleague at Oxford, Ben Ansell, presented. So people can inform themselves in that sort of way.
How do you consume media?
Over my iPhone, like everybody else.
But what sources, or how do you think
Well,
about it?
I have
Who you
a
can?
fairly standard set of, for an American, more of a liberal mindset. The New York Times, the Washington Post, Politico, and then the Financial Times.
Well, thank you very much, David. If you want to know more about his ideas and in general his research and his writings, check out his book, The Decline and Rise of Democracy. I will link it down below in the bio. And yeah, thanks a lot. Thanks a lot for your time.
Thank you.